Welcome to the Center for the Study of World Religions. Happy to host you here today. My pleasant job, Frank Clooney, as director of the center, is simply to say a word of welcome as we gather here this afternoon. I can only say I know there'll be a longer introduction coming, but to have Gary Dorrien here today, to have his lecture is a great event for the school, but also for the center. I think it's exciting that, in particular, that the Lentz lecture is also part of a class, and therefore to have an emphasis on the teaching element and the lecture together, and to note that this room, over the past nearly 60 years now, has hosted so many students of all different degree programs, thinking about so many different religious traditions, and to bring the black social gospel into this context and to discuss it in the space, I think, is a wonderful opportunity for all of us. So I won't take any more of your time, except again to say welcome back if you've been here before, and if you're here for the first time, it's great to have you, and we hope to see you more often. I'll turn things over now to David. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Frank, for welcoming us here and for making this space available to us. It's such a beautiful space with the sun streaming in. If we had an extra 30 degrees on the temperature, it would be almost perfect. So I'm David Hempton, and as Dean of the Divinity School, it's my privilege and great pleasure to welcome this year's Horace W.E.B. Lentz Memorial Lecture and to introduce our very distinguished lecturer, Professor Gary Dorrien. The Lentz Lecture occurs every 3 years, and today we're honoured to have Professor Dorrien speak to us as the Lentz visiting professor at HDS this semester. Professor Dorrien is also the Reinhold Niebuhr Professor of Social Ethics at Union Theological Seminary and Professor of Religion at Columbia University. An Episcopal priest, athlete, renowned scholar, Professor Dorrien is the author of 16 books and more than 250 articles, a number that is still growing, that range from ethics, social theory and theology, to philosophy, politics and history. He has an enormous range in his scholarship. He's a recent past president of the American Theological Society and has a long record of involvement in social justice organizations. His books range from titles like Kantian Reason and Hegelian Spirit, The Idealistic Logic of Modern Theology, which received the Prose Award from the Association of American Publishers for the best book in theology and religious studies in 2012, to The Making of American Liberal Religion, the much acclaimed and influential trilogy, and most recently, The Obama Question, A Progressive Perspective. Currently, I understand his latest research and book project is on W.E.B. Du Bois and Martin Luther King, Jr. in connection with the black social gospel tradition, and we're delighted to hear more about this new project in today's lecture. Professor Dorrien's wide interests are a perfect fit for the Lentz Lecture, and if you'll allow me just a few minutes to speak about the donor of the lecture series and the terms of the gift, you'll see why he is such a perfect fit for this series. Mr. Horace W.E.B. Lentz was a Harvard College graduate, class of 1891, as most of you know, who then went on to become a lawyer and member of the bar in Parkman County, Pennsylvania. The terms of the Lentz Memorial Lectureship are as follows. I bequeath to my alma mater, Harvard University, for the establishment of the Horace D.Y. Lentz Memorial Lectureship, the income to be used for the giving of one or more lectures every third year by some outstanding Christian priest, minister, or layman upon the inspiring things he may discern in the words Christo et Ecclesiae, which appear upon the Harvard seal. Now, these words no longer appear on the Harvard seal, as most of you know, though it's not exactly clear when they were deleted from the Harvard seal, but it seems that they were probably removed in 1936, though there are many, many Harvard seals and many different iterations. But the latest from the Marshal's office is that the seal was changed with those words deleted in 1936. But I know in saying that there's always some historian in the audience who knows it was actually 1932 or January the 13th. Mr. Lentz also established a scholarship fund that provides financial aid to any students from Carbon County, Pennsylvania, who are students at any Harvard school. So his legacy lives on not only through teaching and in the lectures, but also through support for the students, which is a wonderful thing. So as you can see, Professor Dorrien's work, his teaching, mentoring and advising, his research, scholarship and publications, his engagement with social, ethical and philosophical issues in theory as well as in practice, in short, everything he does, and does with so much conviction and passion, are just right for this endowment. And before I invite him to deliver the Lentz lecture, I want also to thank him for being such a good friend and helper of the Divinity School in developing its program in social ethics these past years. I really appreciate all you've contributed to our school. We're very grateful. So the title of Professor Dorrien's talk this afternoon is The New Abolition, W.E.B, Du Bois, and the Black Social Gospel. It's my very great pleasure to welcome Professor Gary Dorrien.
David, thank you for that very welcoming and warm introduction. It's a great delight for me to be here today. So many people from my class contacted me in the past day to say, I'm sorry, I'm not going to be able to be there. And I was starting to wonder who is going to make it there. So I am so grateful to so many of you, a lot of whom I don't recognize, to come here on this odd hour, on this odd day, the first day back from a break. I have a couple of apologies to make. Firstly, this isn't my voice. I have a better voice than this, although at least I am crawling out of something. I'm not just beginning with something, so rest assured on that score. And also, I need to apologize about this talk. I have now written, I'm almost done with volume 2 of this Black Social Gospel project. So I've now got 2 rather sizable books nearly finished on this topic. And I'm at that point, that wonderful point in a scholar's life where I could wing a talk on just about anything at this point. And yet, instead, what I'm going to do to you here is give you something that it's a talk that never really gets rolling. Because I've got so much sort of table setting to do about this subject itself and why there's no literature on it, and defensive arguments to make about it, and just so much a sort of layout about what it is and why and the wherefores and the like, that it's, once you've done all that, well, your time is up and there's no really time to roll. So that's pretty much our situation here, but you will at least get a keen sense of the table when I'm done with this talk. So, the Black Social Gospel is wrongly and strangely overlooked. Few books refer to it. There are no books on this tradition as a whole, and the phrase registers almost nothing on Google. Yet this is the category that best describes Martin Luther King Jr., his chief mentors, his closest movement allies, and the entire tradition of black church social justice activism reaching back to the 1880s. The Civil Rights Movement began in 1884 with a call for what became the National Afro-American League in 1890, and it had a brilliant moment of hope in the Niagara Movement of 1905 to 1909. It entered a second phase of activism in 1910 with the founding of what became the NAACP. It entered the third phase in December 1955 by exploding into a historic mass movement. In every phase, it had leaders that espoused the social ethical religion and politics of modern social Christianity. But the name Civil Rights Movement is usually reserved for the movement of the 1950s and 60s, and most scholars have until quite recently ignored the black social gospel that supported civil rights activism in all 3 of its historic phases, struggled for a place in the black churches, and provided the neo-abolitionist theology that the civil rights movement spoke and sang. Martin Luther King did not come from nowhere, nor did the embattled theology of social justice he espoused. There was a black tradition of the social gospel that gave leaders and ballast to the civil rights movement. It provided much of the movement's intellectual underpinning. It built upon affirmations about human dignity and divine justice that most black churches proclaimed, but distinctly, and it remains a vital perspective. The white social gospel movement is renowned and heavily chronicled. It arose during the Progressive Era and was already a movement by the mid-1880s, with national organizations and a movement agenda linked with progressivism. It had its heyday from 1900 to 1917. It was the greatest wave of social justice activism ever generated by the white mainline Protestant churches in this country. It was championed by such extraordinary figures as Washington Gladden, Graham Taylor, George Herron, Jane Addams, Harry Ward, Vita Scudder, Francis McConnell, and the great Walter Rauschenbusch. By the 1930s, it was mostly a peace and ecumenical movement. The black social gospel arose during the same period and had its heyday in the late 1950s and 1960s. It grew out of the abolitionist tradition, but responded to new challenges in a new era of American history. The abandonment of Reconstruction, the evisceration of constitutional rights, an upsurge of racial lynching and Jim Crow abuse, struggles for mere survival in every part of the nation, and the excruciating question of what a new abolition would require. Like the white social gospel and progressive movements, the early black social gospel responded to industrialization and economic injustice, and regarded the federal government as an indispensable guarantor of constitutional rights. Like the white social gospel, it also wrestled with modern challenges to religious belief. But the black social gospel addressed these things very differently from white progressives, for racial oppression trumped everything in the African American context and refigured how other problems were experienced. White social gospel theologians took for granted their access to the general public. Black social gospel theologians could barely imagine what it felt like to address the general public. They had to create a counter-public sphere merely to have a public. White social gospel theologians sought to be stewards of a good society and otherwise preached a moral influence theory of the cross. Otherwise, they played down the cross of Jesus as problematic for modern Christianity. The black social gospel arose from churches where preaching about the cross was not optional because black Americans experienced it every day as a persecuted, crucified people. Here, the belief in a divine ground of human selfhood powered struggles for black self-determination and campaigns of resistance to white oppression. Black social Christianity, like any tradition, can be defined narrowly or broadly. Broadly, there were 4 groups, plus a tiny socialist flank. The first group identified with Booker T. Washington and his program of political accommodation and economic uplift. The second group contended that African Americans needed their own nation. African Methodist Episcopal Bishop Henry McNeil Turner and Episcopal cleric Alexander Crummell were leading black nationalists. The third group advocated protest activism for racial justice, strongly opposing Washington. Its early exponents included AME minister Reverend Ransom and anti-lynching crusader Ida B. Wells, later Ida B. Wells Barnett. The fourth group navigated between the pro-Washington and anti-Washington forces, imploring against factional division. Its leading proponents included Baptist pastor Adam Clayton Powell Sr. and Baptist educator Nanny Burroughs. All 4 of these ideological factions existed before W.E.B. Du Bois emerged as the intellectual leader of the protest tradition. A full-fledged black social gospel tradition emerged from them, mostly from the third and fourth groups. It stood for social justice, religion, and modern critical consciousness. In addition to Ransom and Powell, it attracted leaders such as African Methodist Episcopal Zion Bishop Alexander Walters, Presbyterian pastor Francis Grimke, and AME minister Richard Wright Jr. This full-orbed black social gospel, which is my operative definition of the category, combined an emphasis on black dignity and personhood with protest activism for racial justice, a comprehensive social justice agenda, an insistence that authentic Christian faith is incompatible with racial prejudice, an emphasis on the social ethical teaching of Jesus and the mode of the social gospel, and an acceptance of modern scholarship and social consciousness. In the early 1900s, black social gospel leaders debated what they should think about Booker T. Washington. After the NAACP was founded and the protest tradition won this ideological argument, the black social gospel attracted a new generation of leaders. Nearly all of them were ordained ministers and held graduate degrees. They included Howard University President Mordecai Johnson, Morehouse College President Benjamin Mays, Baptist pastor Vernon Johns, Morehouse College theologian Howard Thurman, minister and politician Adam Clayton Powell Jr., and Episcopal activist and lawyer Pauli Murray. Then came the King generation, especially the ministers of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, notably Wyatt Walker, Fred Shuttlesworth, Andy Young, and the founders of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, notably James Lawson, John Lewis, Diane Nash, Jim Bevel. After King had come and gone, the black social gospel influenced the development of black liberation theologies. Everyone that I have just named after Booker T is, for me, a Volume 2 figure. Meanwhile, this is a Volume 1 talk. Today, Booker T. Washington is remembered chiefly as the symbol of a demoralizing strategy that sold out black Americans and failed on its own terms. With so much counting against him, it has become difficult to fathom why he was a colossal figure in American life, widely revered across racial lines, and remained so for decades after he lost the argument and passed on. Booker T was complex, wily, opaque, and awesomely accomplished. He built Tuskegee Institute in the face of Ku Klux Klan terrorism, a mania of lynching, a Southern civil religion of lost cause propaganda, and a suffocating plague of disenfranchisement and Jim Crow abuse. He cultivated an image of simple altruism while fighting in a savvy, calculated fashion for as much power as he could get, fulfilling the American fantasy of ascending from poverty and disadvantage to greatness. Washington publicly accommodated disenfranchisement and segregation while privately organizing legal efforts to thwart both. He told African Americans to stay out of politics even after he became the nation's leading black patronage broker. He denied that he made federal patronage appointments for blacks long after he routinely made all of them. He hobnobbed with the high and mighty, but stayed in touch with the struggles of ordinary people. He attracted wealthy benefactors, became an advisor to 4 U.S. presidents, launched hundreds of community schools, and amassed a powerful political machine. He bought black newspapers and controlled them, denying that too. He controlled college presidents through his influence with philanthropists, monopolizing racial philanthropy, and bullied his competitors, hiring spies to infiltrate rival organizations, which fueled a mighty backlash against him. For a while, he was so dominant that many Bookerites believed there was no such thing as a legitimate opposition. Booker T believed it adamantly. He keenly understood that most white Southerners of his time did not want black Americans to succeed at anything besides picking cotton. Any black success at anything else represented the frightening specter of Negro rule. A black postmaster represented Negro rule. A black shopkeeper, a black teacher, a black lawyer represented Negro rule. But to give African Americans a glimmer of opportunity in a brutally hostile context, he pretended not to know it. Booker T. Washington got to be number one by bartering the civil and political rights of black Americans for a season of interracial peace and economic opportunity. On the few occasions that he explicitly explained his strategy, he wrote quintessential descriptions of political realism. But everything got worse for African Americans during this ostensible season, while Washington ascended to national eminence, setting him up for the devastating objection that black Americans had not appointed him to be number one. Booker T. Washington was the first black leader to be selected by white Americans, an arrangement he lived to see unravel. For the race problem in America was white racism, and the antidote to it had no chance of coming out of Alabama. Washington epitomized an influential version of the social gospel. He was powerfully linked with conservative assimilation and its wing of the white social gospel, led by Brooklyn minister Lyman Abbott, editor of Outlook magazine. Abbott serialized Washington's memoir, Up from Slavery, to his vast audience, and he lauded Washington as the answer to the race problem. The very term social gospel gained currency in the 1890s as the title of a journal by a white Christian socialist community in Georgia seeking to build a school modeled on Tuskegee's trinity of work, education, and Christianity. For Washington, Christianity was a practical faith. It nurtured the correct moral virtues, and it helped to build a good society, exactly as Washington's white social gospel friends said. Washington urged that black church religion, especially in the South, wrongly separated religion from morality. Churches needed to become more ethical, he would say, caring about righteousness, and less emotional, caring about rapture. Every alternative to Washington was compelled to define its relationship to him. Nationalists took the Turner path of national separation and/or African immigration. Alexander Crummell was an important leader of this group, as was Episcopal bishop and missionary James Hawley. Then, as now, there were different kinds of black nationalism. The idea that all people of African descent share something as a nation or people. In the 19th and 20th centuries, the posited basis for national belonging was sometimes biological, rendering the nation as analogous to a biological organism, and/or ontological, making a claim about the distinct being of blackness, and/or cultural or socio-historical, making a claim about black cultural authenticity or distinctiveness. But defined this broadly, there were nationalists in all four streams of black social Christianity. The emphatically nationalist group espoused more stringent forms of nationalism, contending that blacks were a distinct people needing to create a sovereign nation state and, even if the statehood project failed, a black civilization. Some nationalists devoted themselves to colonizing West Africa, following Turner, or Haiti, following Hawley, but many eventually gave up on immigration, following Crummell. Much of the nationalist tradition shared the emphases of Crummell and Turner on moral uplift, authority, elite leadership, and the shortcomings of ordinary black Americans. Despite its rhetoric of separation and racial pride, the nationalist tradition ironically played a major role in transmitting assimilationist values into African American culture. Most black nationalists were politically conservative, and nearly all of them were culturally conservative. Black nationalism had an electrifying moment after World War I with the rise of Marcus Garvey's Back to Africa movement. A generation earlier, Crummell and Turner clashed over the question whether nationalists should continue to strive for a separate nation state. Turner became the dominant figure in this school of thought and activism by saying yes. The third group vehemently opposed Washington's strategy and his Tuskegee machine, calling for a new abolitionist politics of racial and social justice. The full-fledged black social gospel emerged mostly from this group. There were many others in addition to Ransom and Wells: Baptist ministers James Diggs, Peter James Bryant, William Jefferson White, Congregational minister Byron Gunner, Episcopal rectors Robert Bagnall and George Fraser Miller, others, but they are all long forgotten. The fourth group helped to sway how the argument over Bookerism turned out. In the early 1900s, the groups advocating protest and accommodation fought each other ferociously with a lot of name-calling. Both sides alienated people that disliked ideological bickering. Religious communities naturally brought together the rival groups and the non-aligned. At church, ministers appealed to Christian fellowship and racial solidarity. Moreover, many ministers had friends on both sides of the partisan divide. The fourth group urged that Du Bois-style militancy and Washington-style realism were both indispensable. In addition to Burroughs and Powell Sr., leading figures included sociologist Monroe Work and George Haynes, Methodist minister William Henry Brooks, and Baptist feminists Lucy Smith and Sarah Layton. Meanwhile, there was a tiny flank that held out against capitalism. Baptist minister George W.E.B was a leading figure in this group, and I give him long, loving attention in Volume 1. W.E.B had a long career as a Socialist Party organizer, and he was also active in the Industrial Workers of the World, the IWW. There were black socialists besides Du Bois and Ransom in the mainstream of the NAACP, notably Bagnall and George Fraser Miller. But socialism had a lot going against it in black communities. A fantasized solidarity with a racist white proletariat, the specter of appearing to be anti-American, and the desire of African Americans to own property and to succeed in the existing system. These very factors suppressed Du Bois's socialism for over 20 years. For some in the fourth group, the founding of the NAACP and the subsequent fading of Washington nullified the necessity of making a both-and argument, while others stuck to it for the rest of their lives. Numerous conventions have long kept the black social gospel from being remembered, and they remain obstacles to recovering it today. It is usually assumed that the early black social gospel numbered only a handful of ministers. This is why I began today by refuting the deadliest assumption. For decades, scholars claimed that the social gospel was an overwhelmingly white phenomenon that ignored racial justice issues. This twofold claim misleadingly generalized from a few social gospel leaders, or often especially simply their main books, obscuring the complex and conflicted debates that white Christian progressives held about racial justice. And, far more importantly, it obscured the very existence of black social gospelers. In addition, Washington and Du Bois are usually read out of social Christianity, notwithstanding that both of them influenced it enormously. Many scholars have recycled the convention that black churches were too self-centered and preoccupied with survival to advocate a social justice agenda, never mind that the black social gospel leaders, thus ignored, addressed this issue constantly every week of their lives. A broader convention of American historiography has applied with particular vengeance to black social gospel leaders, especially of this generation. Religious intellectuals no longer mattered by the end of the 19th century. In that case, black religious intellectuals don't matter whether or not they existed. Both verdicts got ballast from black academics of the early 20th century that historians tend to favor. Ralph Bunche, Aline Locke, Abram Harris, E. Franklin Frazier, Rayford Logan. All shared the customary academic prejudice against religion and religious intellectuals, contending that the black church was hopelessly provincial and conservative. So, black social gospel intellectuals such as Ransom, Wright, and Johnson had no chance of being remembered. And even Mays and Thurman were overlooked for decades. When I was in graduate school, nobody talked about Mays or Thurman. Another kind of dismissal flips the unimportant or didn't exist rationales, reasoning that the category social gospel does not name anything worth distinguishing in African American Christianity. This objection comports with the image of a singular, politically active black church that many people hold. But black churches have always been widely diverse theologically, politically, culturally, and socially. There has never been a dominant or singular black church in the mold of the usual stereotype, which ironically is a social gospel construct. the very influence of the social gospel idea of what the black church is or should be has obscured that it is a social gospel idea, which many black religious communities reject. Throughout the first and second phases of the civil rights movement, and even in its heyday third phase, only a minority of Afro-American congregations supported social justice preaching and activism. The chief founder of the National Baptist Convention, William Simmons, was accused throughout his career of replacing religion with politics, notwithstanding his powerful revival preaching. Reverend Ransom's clerical colleagues in Chicago and Boston were so offended by his advocacy of the social gospel that they drove him out of both cities. This, despite the fact that Ransom belonged to an abolitionist denomination, and he ministered in the two cities that seemed best suited to support social gospel activism. Ransom and Wright, after years of being thwarted by bishops, reluctantly concluded that they had to become bishops, after which they vied with bishops that wanted nothing to do with protest movements. Carter Woodson, writing the first comprehensive history of black Christianity in 1921, organized his entire account around the battle between a minority tradition of progressives linked to abolitionism and the social gospel and a dominant tradition of conservatives that resisted modernity and social religion. A decade later, Benjamin Mays documented that most black churches did not preach or practice anything like his concept of social gospel religion. A generation later, King had ample experience with this problem, as his own denomination opposed the civil rights movement, and only a minority of black congregations supported it during his lifetime. The founders of black social Christianity were distinct and marginalized in their interactions with the white social gospel movement and within African American Christianity. They were marginalized ecumenically because white American Protestantism was every bit as segregated and white supremacist as the rest of society. They were marginalized in black churches for pressing a national social justice agenda and for adopting social gospel theology. Some of them succeeded sufficiently to win denominational leadership positions, take over the publishing houses, and change the mainstream. But the founders' long two-sided struggle for legitimacy and recognition kept them from being remembered after they were gone. Simmons, Ransom, Wells Barnett, Burroughs, Walters, W.E.B, Johnson, and Wright would not have been forgotten had scholars and journalists paid attention to the black social gospel. The black social gospel had a distinct integrity, and much of it had significant dealings with white social gospelers and progressives. Some became public figures by bridging both worlds, providing rare evidence that such a thing was possible in Jim Crow America. Walters, Johnson, Mays, and Thurman had sparkling careers on the lecture circuits of ecumenical organizations, especially the student Christian movement. Some black social gospel leaders had dual leaderships in black and white Baptist denominations. Some belonged to black denominations that were deeply involved in the ecumenical movement. Some operated in predominantly white denominations, especially the Episcopal and Congregational churches. Ransom, Walters, Haynes, and Mays were important players in the Federal Council of Churches, and Mays was the Socialist Party's leading black organizer and author. But these relationships were not reciprocal. White church leaders did not treat their Afro-American colleagues as equal contributors to social gospel ecumenism, and the Socialist Party made very little attempt to recruit black members. They left that field wide open for the Communist Party. I confess to admiring the black apostles that dreamed of abolishing America's system of racial caste. They resisted with shimmering dignity, even as some of them were deeply wounded by racism. They wrung a liberating message from the Christianity of their time. They did not settle for making segregation more tolerable. They rebelled and endured, taking the long view, laying the groundwork for something better than the regime of oppression and exclusion that they inherited. They conceived what social salvation meant in post-Reconstruction black religion. Sometimes they played into the hands of white racists, advocating what scholars today call the politics of respectability. This approach recycled harmful stereotypes about Afro-American culture and manners. The nationalist tradition, in particular, sometimes folded ugly denigrations of black humanity into its message of racial solidarity and pride. Some social gospel preaching about family life caused particular harm to women in perpetuating stereotypes. Many social gospel ministers exhorted women to keep the churches going with no chance of becoming church or public leaders. Whenever they preached about gay and lesbian sexuality, it was in condemnation. Sometimes they exaggerated the conservatism of their black church opponents, which undercut the very moral agencies that they sought to mobilize. But the problems of developing black leaders and transcending what Mays called compensatory religion were terribly real for black social gospel ministers, and without their witness, the radical social gospel theology and activism of King are simply inexplicable. Henry McNeill Turner and William Simmons were pioneers of black social Christianity, bridging the Civil War and progressive generations, in different ways clearing a path for the social gospel. Turner enabled new abolition movements that he did not join, as he believed that America was hopelessly hostile territory for blacks. He was singly responsible for much of the explosive growth of the AME Church in Georgia during Reconstruction. He roared for equal rights and the dream of African immigration. He preached a gospel of Christian revival and personal responsibility, teaching that God is black. He defied white terrorists fearlessly. He railed against enemies, but was rough on underachievers and whiners, too, blistering what he called scullions. Having worked hard for the Republican Party, Turner wanted to love it, but he despised it after the party sold out Reconstruction. Turner became easy to forget after Du Bois entered the picture, but he was a giant figure in the black church struggle against white racism that distinctly prefigured liberation theology. Simmons had a similar generational experience, although he died young, and his modernism was stronger. Like Turner, Simmons worked hard for radical Reconstruction. He treasured the abolitionists, and like them, he conceived the God of the Bible as a partisan, liberating friend of the poor and oppressed. As a journalist, author, educator, and minister, Simmons kept alive the witness and lore of David Walker, Sojourner Truth, Nat Turner, Henry Highland Garnet, Frederick Douglass, and other abolitionists. He stood up for the rights and empowerment of women, insisting that feminism had an important role to play in the new abolition. He mediated the debate among black Baptists over assimilation versus separatism, taking a middling position that did not prevail in the National Baptist Convention. He also mediated, before Du Bois came along, an intense debate among black Baptists about the priority of higher education. Had Simmons lived to see the issue become Du Bois versus Washington, he undoubtedly would have kept saying that higher education and vocational education were equally important and should not be set against another. At least, he would have kept saying it until this question was no longer a defining issue for the new abolition. Reverdy Ransom, Ida Wells Barnett, and Alexander Walters played major roles in early black social Christianity. Ransom espoused liberal social gospel theology and radical social gospel socialism. He personified the spirit of the Niagara movement, so much so that when he gave his electrifying address at Harper's Ferry, Du Bois didn't even give his talk that year. He had someone else give it for him because he didn't want to suffer by comparison. Ransom pioneered the cause of black Christian socialism, and he cut his teeth in politics by joining Wells's anti-lynching crusade, a very lonely position to be in at that time. Wells, more than anybody, established that the struggle against lynching had to be defining for the new abolition. She inspired, implored, and shamed such a movement into being. For a while, in the early 1890s, she was a sensational figure. Then she married Frederick Barnett and pulled back from full-time activism, just as Washington skyrocketed to eminence and Walters emerged as a civil rights leader. Walters tried to redefine the black Christian mainstream by blending social gospel theology, political independence, Pan-African consciousness, and civil rights activism. He symbolized the volatile racial politics of the early 20th century, advocating civil rights while trying to hold together an activist organization with pro-Washington and anti-Washington flanks. In Walters' case, the usual story of embattlement with the church did not occur, because the AME Zion Church took pride in him and his leadership. But he had his hands full trying to sustain a protest movement. These figures, differently, made society a subject of redemption, and all of them made a mark before Du Bois versus Washington became the issue, which soon cut to a famous binary. Kelly Miller introduced the distinction between black radicalism and black conservatism that has ruled this field ever since, identifying Du Bois with radicalism and Washington with conservatism. Miller was a Howard University dean and sociologist, socially conservative, anti-feminist, strongly pro-capitalist, thoroughly middle class, and imbued with indignation that white America violated his rights as a human being and a citizen. His binary had an unintended upshot, as he tried to keep the two groups from breaking apart. Miller stressed that even black conservatives opposed racism and that the Du Bois group was vastly outnumbered by the other one. Many ministers implored against breaking apart. Adam Clayton Powell Sr. put it poignantly many times from the pulpit of Abyssinian Church. There are no black conservatives, Powell would say, so why are we fighting over radical versus conservative? Liberation historian Gayrod Wilmore, in his landmark work, Black Religion and Black Radicalism, 1973, offered an answer that built upon Miller's historic definition. First, there was definitely such a thing as black conservatism, contrary to integrationist liberals like Powell. Second, what mattered was to define and defend black radicalism. Wilmore offered a three-factor definition, explaining that the radical tradition in black religion sought to be liberated from white domination, commended respect for Africa, and used protest and agitation in the struggle for liberation. Wilmore noted that black radicalism, thus defined, was usually less political and ideological than other forms of radical politics, such as social democracy or communism or progressivism, what have you. In black radicalism, race and color are at the root of the problems of Western civilization. Black radicalism conceived and perceived the soul sickness of white society, something that's so much deeper than mere racism. Thus, it did not sing the liberal song of racial integration. For Wilmore, the exemplary black radical was Turner, who towered above all others of his time. Turner was deeply alienated from white society. He called for reparations to finance black immigration to West Africa, whereas social gospel liberals like Powell complained about fighting because supposedly they lacked the will to fight white supremacy. On this basis, Wilmore ignored black social gospel leaders of the early 20th century. He barely mentioned any in his indispensable account of black religion, a textbook that dominated black religious historiography for 4 decades. Wilmore argued that Turner should have challenged Washington for national leadership after Frederick Douglass died, but Turner failed to try, and afterwards, black Christianity got a generation of leaders barely worth mentioning. The black social gospel founders deserved more credit than that. They advocated social justice causes that Turner spurned, and there were 3 large reasons why Turner did not challenge Washington in the late 1890s. He lost influence by insulting African Americans with harshly demeaning statements. He lost followers by insisting on back to Africa, and he shared most of Washington's ideology. Had Turner felt compelled to choose between Washington and Du Bois, he would have chosen Washington, for whom he had much greater respect. As it was, Turner believed that Du Bois versus Washington was simply about the wrong things. so he looked away in disgust. African Americans had to have their own nation. For Turner, everything else was a sideshow, a waste of time. The Du Bois group had a better idea, even if it eventually required cutting a deal with white liberals, something that black social gospel leaders were willing to do, with no lack of commitment to abolishing white oppression. Du Bois is central to this story because he changed the conversation and he made everybody deal with him. He did not merely take up an existing critique of Washington's strategy, putting it more colorfully or memorably. He inspired a revolution of consciousness that defined the problem of the 20th century. He provided a language for the problem of the color line, and he helped to launch the Pan-African movement, the Niagara movement, and the NAACP. And he helped to radicalize the black social gospel through his influence on Ransom, Wright, Walters, Waldron, Powell, Johnson, Mays, and others. The double consciousness that Du Bois projected onto all African Americans was deeply and powerfully true for him, and a source of creativity in him. He was simultaneously black and American. He grew up with little experience of racial abuse, yet he became an unsurpassed critic of the color line. He railed against the evils of white civilization while affirming the intellectualism and progressive social ideals that he internalized from white civilization. Du Bois fashioned an alternative to the draining debate between nationalists and integrationists by affirming his own tortured double consciousness. Black Americans had to stop taking sides about which of their selves to give up, opting for a richer, contentious, full-bodied struggle for liberation and radical democracy. Du Bois was educated during the heyday of evolutionary idealism and social Darwinism. He got a pretty strong smack of it here at the economics department here. And his early writings were shot through with both. It took him several years to drop neo-Lamarckian theory and social Darwinism, to temper his emphasis on moral failings and uplift idealism, to let go of romantic imperialism, and to pull back from his neo-Hegelian idealism. Later, he absorbed Freud and Marx. He dropped the idealistic, dualistic idea of double consciousness. But through all his shifts and phases, he fixed on exemplary individuality, the character, status, personhood, and circumstances of personal examples. He construed his own life as an example through which he fashioned his ideas about race, which helps to explain how it is that he wrote 4 autobiographies. Du Bois mined the fissure between his status as a member of a denigrated caste and his role as a race leader. He stuck to this focus long after he mitigated its elitist drawbacks by embracing radical democratic socialism. For many years, he had to live down the charge that he cared about elite performers while Washington cared about ordinary people. There was always something ridiculous about this comparison. Yet Du Bois provided grist for it by insisting, in the spirit of Cromwell, the Negro race, like all races, is going to be saved by its exceptional men. This trope provided quotable material for countless sermons, editorials, church bulletins, and commencement addresses. Gradually, Du Bois bridled at hearing it from speakers lacking his commitment to radical democracy. He got increasingly forthright about economic justice and the ravages of global capitalism. But that did not dissuade him from focusing on what it meant to be an exemplar in a wretched time. Du Bois loathed religious orthodoxy because, he argued, it stunted human souls. He could be blistering on this theme, which gave heartburn to social gospel ministers who tried to say similar things without offending their churchgoers. In 1940, speaking at Wilberforce University's commencement, Du Bois excoriated the school's Christian legacy as, quote, childish belief in fairy tales, a word-of-mouth adherence to dogma, and a certain sectarian exclusiveness. Wilberforce's tradition of religious orthodoxy, he declared, quote, was a miserable apprehension of the teaching of Christ, end quote. But Du Bois had a spiritual wellspring of his own and a keen appreciation of Jesus and a lover's quarrel with the black church. His writings were strewn with religious images and references throughout his career, even after he supposedly dropped religion for Marxism. His book, The Souls of Black Folk, famously invoked our spiritual strivings and lauded the spirituals. His book, Darkwater, began with Du Bois's social gospel credo. It conjured a black baby Jesus in his essay, The Second Coming. It conjured an adult black Jesus in his scathing essay, Jesus Christ in Texas. And it ended with a hymn to the peoples in which the Buddha walked with Christ. As late as the 1950s, Du Bois was still writing about saving the tattered shreds of God. His passionate, unorthodox spiritual sensibility came through to many readers. They caught that a religious, arguably Christian passion lay behind his furious attacks on unworthy ministers and church dogmatism. Even at Wilberforce, lashing the university for hiding behind mediocre religion, Du Bois stumped for social gospel religion. Quote, Christianity means sympathy. It means the realization of what it costs a human being to live and support a family. Christianity means unselfishness. It's the willingness to forego your personal advantage and give up some desires for the sake of a larger end, which will be for the advantage of a greater number of people, unquote. By 1940, that was an echo of what the younger Du Bois had hoped the church would become under the sway of the social gospel. In the early 20th century, he was a critical booster, taking for granted that the movement for black liberation had to be religion-friendly. Nothing compared to the black church as a source of inspiration, hope, solidarity, identity, belonging, moral language, transcendent meaning. Black Americans own nothing else outright. Du Bois stressed that any movement worth building had to share in the life of the black church, speaking its language of hope and redemption. The Niagara movement, and later the NAACP, had to have religious leaders, reaching beyond its usual circle of urban professionals. My work on this subject is distinctly important to me and is long in coming. I grew up in a lower-class, semi-rural area in mid-Michigan, where my father became passably white by moving away from Michigan's Upper Peninsula. His Cree heritage made him a target of racial abuse while growing up, and he raised his 5 sons as definitely white, never mind that we had obviously Native American relatives. My nominally Catholic family got to Mass just enough for something to break through my everyday, lower-class, sports-fixated horizon, the image of the suffering God on a cross. Then the stunning witness of King and the civil rights movement similarly broke through, eventually melding in my thought and feeling with the cross of Christ. Long before I understood much of anything about politics or religion, King was the formative figure for me, the exemplar and of the peacemaking and justice-making way of Jesus. That was the sum total of my religious worldview when I squeaked into college, mostly to play sports. 4 decades later, it is still my bedrock. My neighbors and relatives did not talk about going to college or having something called a career, and they would have repudiated the notion that being white conferred any cultural privileges upon them whatsoever, even as they struggled to secure whatever white privilege they could get, and passed it to me. Interrogating one's racial bias is exceedingly difficult. Interrogating one's complicity in white supremacy, a structure of power based on privilege that presumes to define what is normal, is harder yet. I am torn between knowing that I am terribly limited as an interpreter of African American social Christianity and in believing that it deserves all the books it can get, even from me. For 20 years, I have sprinkled discussions of the black social gospel into various books, arguing that this is the category that best describes the theological and social ethical line that leads to King. 20 years ago, there were not many of us. Now there are many more, mainly because African American scholars have entered the academy in significant numbers. Claiborne Carson, Evelyn Brooks Higginbotham, Calvin Morris, Randall Jelks, Tony Pinn, Jonathan Walton, Walter Fluker, and others have played leading roles in recovering the language and literature of the black social gospel. I have one misgiving in contributing to this work of retrieval and correct naming, namely, that this is overwhelmingly a tradition of male ministers. Some women broke through anyway, achieving public influence, usually by working through organizations they created. Burroughs, Lucy Smith, and Sarah Layton worked through a national organization they created, the Women's Convention of the National Baptist Convention. Mary Church Terrell, Lucy Thurman, Mary Talbert, and others similarly served as leaders of the National Association of Colored Women, which began in 1896 with Victorian calls to true womanhood and purified homes, but went on to become deeply involved in suffrage, anti-lynching, and anti-segregation activism. For many women, the coming of the NACW was a godsend precisely because it offered Afro-American women an opportunity to work together outside the church. Some women found their way to holiness through Pentecostal congregations, which rejected the assimilated formality of traditional churches and that allowed female leadership. The holiness and Pentecostal movements were overwhelmingly female on both sides of the color line, featuring oral music, rhythm, testimony, ecstatic praise traditions, and a holistic worldview. The irony of sanctification Christianity thus cuts across racial lines. With few exceptions, the churches that had female leaders did not embrace social justice religion, and the churches that embraced the social gospel did not allow female leaders. Historian Barbara Diane Savage, in her luminous reflection on the politics of black religion, Your Spirits Walk Beside Us, notes that three scholars had the greatest influence on the historiography of 19th and early 20th century black American Christianity: Du Bois, Woodson, Mays. All were unsettled by the emotional fervor of rural black worship and the sanctification churches. All appreciated the emotional vitality of black religion while calling for modernized churches committed to social justice theology. All said sympathetic things about the women that comprised and sustained black churches, and all three perpetuated the view that black churches needed strong and progressive male ministers more than they needed anything else. Savage aptly observes that Du Bois, Woodson, and Mays, by giving highest priority to developing a male clerical elite, silenced the two largest groups in this picture: the majority of church members, who were women, and the majority of men who were not in the churches. Black America needed an elite of male ministers because it had a dearth of male leadership, and the church was the most important institution in African American life. Du Bois said it as a sympathetic fellow traveler who rarely went to church. Mays said it as a Baptist minister and theologian who mentored students as a college president. Woodson said it as a Baptist layman who founded the Journal of Negro History and what became Black History Month. Woodson attended Shiloh Baptist Church in Washington, D.C. for two reasons. Quote, "I find they're better people than I do on the outside. And two, I find my people there, and I cannot help them unless I remain among them." Well, that was a decidedly social gospel rationale for belonging to a church. Woodson acknowledged that women made the best Christians and kept the churches going. But his only word for them was to carry on as they were. He had a bold vision of a united black superchurch that got rid of all the denominations, but he envisioned no female leaders in it. The wing of black Christianity that talked about being progressive and modern pulled back when it came to women. Among the male founders, the leading exceptions in my generation, in this first volume 1, were Turner, Simmons, and Ransom. For similar reasons, it had no progressive inklings concerning gay and lesbian sexuality, a subject on which both Powells spoke vehemently from the pulpit. The black social gospel thus had shortcomings in the very areas that royal churches today. But this tradition has a legacy unsurpassed by any religious tradition or movement in U.S. American history, period. For 50 years, black religion fixed on the dream of abolition. Then came emancipation, a veritable coming of the Lord, as Du Bois put it, only to be followed by the terrible necessity of imagining what a new abolition would be. Black Christian leaders of the late 19th and early 20th centuries had much at stake in the question whether they should fuse social justice politics with progressive theology. There were just enough of these defiant, dignified, visionary figures to make a difference. They paved the way to the civil rights explosion of the 1950s and 60s, helping to inspire our greatest liberation movement. Thank you, friends.
Thanks, Gary, very much for a wonderfully erudite and rich lecture. I was just kind of reflecting on my notes, and I kind of figured if I get to work tonight, I might beat you to these 2 volumes. But I know I can't. So we have time. Anyone who needs to move on, feel free to do so, but we have plenty of time for questions.
Several of these people had sent me notes on the way, so I was like, I know, on their way out.
So you want to just take the questions?
You bet. Thanks,
Yeah,
Steve.
okay. So floor's open.
Questions, issues? I'm game for any part of this. I mean, it's such a sprawling, just barely this, deep kind of talk. So any part of it, I'm willing to go for. Yes.
Sure, I've misinterpreted this, but you seem to be saying that the social gospel people were in the church but not of the church. I mean, they were that I can see by your face I've got this wrong, but they were their Christianity was they certainly weren't going in it for anything like piety. If I get this completely wrong.
Yeah. I am miscommunicating here. No, this is a burden not only for me and what's coming with this, but so much of my work actually has been about this. I mean, the social gospel, I think, is misread this way all the time. One reason almost every year I insist that classes actually read a fair amount of Rauschenbusch, for example, is just to dispel this idea that people like this weren't, deeply prayerful, didn't believe in God, weren't just deeply Christian. The most religious people they knew were these social gospel figures. There's something in the social gospel that has this danger that sort of plays out in generations where you end up attracting, like, for example, the places where I teach, where you get people who are very political and don't have very much, of a religious or theological conviction at all, and they just think of the church as a place where they can live out their social justice activism. That certainly happens. It happens in this line, and the social gospel, one could make an argument, is that's where that sort of line begins. So I'm not denying that is true, and that describes some of my best friends and so on. But what I'm vehemently not agreeing with is that defines the social gospel per se. This whole generation of the founders, all of the great figures in this tradition, even hardline political people like Harry Ward are still, he gets on his knees every night and prays before he goes to bed. And that's why he's in the church, is because he believes in the gospel. And what slays them precisely is that we've had generations, even centuries of people praying, "Thy kingdom come," without the faintest thought about what that really means. And so to them, this was a revolutionary discovery. Think about what that really means. That it has social ethical import. You're actually supposed to live society, and that in fact salvation, to be saving, has to be more than just your concern about whether you're saved for heaven, but whether you are redeeming the ravages of sin in the world. And that requires this, social dimension. That's the very basis of the social gospel. I mean, it's not that the social gospel was the first movement to have a social conscience or anything like that. I'm not saying anything like that. Obviously, all through the Christian history, there have been people who see the moral, social content that is in Scripture. But what does define the social gospel movement and sets it off is that here you have a kind of social consciousness about the existence of social structure. There is a commitment that Christianity is a mission to transform the very structures of society in the direction of social justice. Neither part of that sentence is really a possibility before the 1880s, because you need early sociology and social consciousness and just the whole conceptuality that's in that sentence before you can say it. That does mark off the social gospel from previous generations of, say, abolitionism and others. Now, there's nothing in, certainly, not only is there nothing in that precludes having Christian conviction, the people who were in that movement thought to the contrary, that they have back the very social, ethical meaning, content of the gospel in a way that their own parents didn't. And so they're finally living out the faith in a way that is convictional, in a way that wasn't before. And this does... No, you started me on something. This is something of a lead-in as to what one of the things I admire about this generation. This is a generation that had an awful lot on its plate. This is the same generation that had to deal with historical criticism, because American theology was a latecomer to that, to dealing with historical critical approach to the Bible, and to dealing with Darwinism and all that, because that was late to really arrive in the U.S. too. It screened out. We had the Civil War, come along first, and then the Gilded Age and so on, and so much else. And the towering intellectual of their period is Herbert Spencer. Herbert Spencer, for God's sake, the theorist of social Darwinism. And that is intimidating. How do they even know enough to take him on? And somewhere there's got to be a line between what's true about Darwinism and what's just morally a non-starter about it. Because these people know the gospel, and they say, whatever it is that's true about it in its own sphere, it cannot be that it applies over here. And so they founded the American Economics Association in 1885 in order to take on social Darwinism, taking on the dominant intellectual of that time. And that's just all based on, if I'm a Christian, I can't possibly be a social Darwinist. And not only that, we have to take it on even when we're assailed by our doubts. Yes, we don't have anybody who compares to Herbert Spencer, who's going to be able to tell us how it lays out. And we don't know where the line is, but there's got to be one somewhere. This is the irony with Du Bois. I went into a little bit of this today, right? That Du Bois himself is fighting it off. He is social Darwinist when he writes Philadelphia Negro. The policy sections of that book are just, straight out of social Darwinism. It's not that he wants to be a social Darwinist. He just doesn't think he has a choice. Science is speaking, so he's trying to limit the damage for, the group he cares about, and working awfully hard at it. In that book. Fortunately, we get a socio-historical approach to the social sciences coming out of the University of Chicago and other places in the early 20th century, and this story turns, and these social gospelers say, okay, see, we were right. But all they really had going for them, before you take this turn, before intellectual history makes a turn that kind of validates a lot of what they were doing, they really are just running on the moral content of the gospel. They've got to be sincere about that. Otherwise, they're just lost. And they were. Rauschenbusch wrote this beautiful poem at the end of his life. He says, if it hadn't been my personal religion, my life just would have been an empty shell. And he writes this just stunning poem called The Gateway to God that's just right out of his prayer life. And you can't read that and think, these people are a little short on spirituality. To the contrary. Jonathan?
Thank you for this, and thank you for writing these volumes. This will go a long way to help expand the historiography, so I really appreciate that. I guess the question I have about Du Bois is, in placing him in this social gospel tradition, how do we make sense? I'm actually reading through this with a graduate student now, his early writings on religion, right, say from like about 1897 to 1910, where he seems to, all of the social implications and social engagement of what he calls Negro churches, like he sees as pathological, right, or he sees as problematic. Right? It's all amusement for him, and churches need to do what churches are supposed to do, and other social organizations are supposed to do what they're supposed to do, and that seems to be the problem, right? So obviously we know that he has, like you named it, you hit it dead on, the kind of pragmatic dimension of we have to engage churches, right? Because that's where the people are and the like. But in terms of his kind of fundamental belief in what he called the problem of amusement, right? You know, that churches shouldn't be in the business of engaging social spheres in this way because it takes them away from what he viewed as moral religious concerns.
Thank you. That's almost too good a question for me right now. It calls up so much. Firstly, I am not arguing that Du Bois is in this black social gospel tradition. I am not making the Edward Bloom argument. Edward Bloom has this argument that, yeah, that's where he belongs, and then the liberation theology comes from it, and he's just right there, you know, and it's just wrong to not see him in it, right? That it requires some sort of anti-Christian prejudice or whatever to think that way. And then there's the book that goes with it. I'm just blanking for now. A guy went to Columbia, religious historian. Can you help me? Can think of Jonathan Cahn, thank you, who makes Du Bois is a religious naturalist. That's so clearly what Du Bois is, and not Christian, not, right? So you got these kind of dueling books that have come out, you know, fairly recently that I think are both wonderful. I'm very appreciative of both, of giving us back this, you know, religiously musical Du Bois, who does have things to say, and that and certainly is in our discussion here. But I think that there is a problem with both of these arguments. They've got to have an essentialist Du Bois who has a position and who then sort of carries through, who isn't double-minded at all about this, who doesn't move back and forth, which is what I think is right about this. I would not try to sell people and saying, oh, he is in this black social gospel line that I'm writing about. However, I think it would be even silly for me to try to write this book without Du Bois being so in it. My problem was, you know, he's just so fabulous that I'm always worried that he's just going to take it over, right? He's just so strong, and there's always some next thing to quote. That was my problem in Volume 1. He ends up being, you know, there's more about him than anybody else in Volume 1 now, and then he ended up in the subtitle because I just had to, you know, own up to it. Yet that's not to say that I'm placing him there the way say Ed Bloom does. I don't think that's right, and I don't need to have him there in order to be able to make my case. What this also does help me to say, though, and bring up is in this framing business. You know, Jim Cone just wanted me to go narrow, narrow, narrow. Just go with the people who just call themselves social gospelers and who just go by your narrowest possible definition and just do though. There's enough of those people, and that, you know, that'll be enough. And if I'd done that, I'd have been spared this 2 massive volumes. I might have been able to do it in 1 massive volume. But, you know, think of what you're losing by doing that. You got all these people who aren't really in the story I'm telling, and yet they're enormously important to it, and they're conversational partners, and in some points of their lives they've got 1 foot in it, and so you miss the richness, how robust and just contentious and full-orbed this whole thing is when you just go the way I did, just say, okay, there's narrow and there's broad. More broadly, okay, it's a more unwieldy thing, but I think in the end, though I regret that I'm throwing these 2 big volumes out there. I think to have missed that nationalist story that could be read out from the story that I'm telling. I just think wouldn't be right. To try to minimize Du Bois, I suppose I could have done that, although it gets weird because Ransom is so influenced by Du Bois, and Ransom is the Du Bois thinker in this line. And Ransom and Du Bois are working together. I mean, they literally did subscription deals together. You know, you could get the Crisis and AME Church Review, get one, but get the other. And advertising and kind of conspiring together and in the Niagara movement together and so on. So they're partners in a struggle. And then others who are not nearly as close to Du Bois as certainly as Ransom is, or Walters, people like that. Nonetheless, they've got Du Bois in their heads. I mean, they know every week what he said last week in Crisis, and are in some sort of interrogation with him. So same thing. I mean, to have even tried to leave him out in order to do Jim's version of I should have done, I just finally said no. I just have to deal with unwieldiness and explain how narrow and broad. I'm going to go broad for quite a while until I get to narrow, and then we'll narrow out and then just go with that line. So that's how it came out. Thank you. Thank you, Jonathan. Others? Yes, Dan.
Yeah, so this is kind of in a similar vein. I wonder if you could say a little bit about kind of the particular institutional dynamics of the Black social gospel in terms of the role of the institutional church vis-a-vis other institutions. You give a lot of space to Du Bois, you give a lot of space to Booker T. Washington. I don't know of any historian of the white social gospel who would give that much space in the narrative to Theodore Roosevelt or to Gene Debs or to Henry George, people outside kind of the institutional structure of the church. Is this because the Black social gospel is different in this respect? Is it because the historians of the white social gospel have done it wrong, or is it simply because of the towering personality of Du Bois himself?
Well, firstly, Washington doesn't see himself as outside the church.
He's not a minister, I mean.
He's not a minister, right. But he was quite, this is one of those perennial issues at Tuskegee. How Christian is it, and is it Christian enough? He has all these Unitarian friends up in this part of the country where he is half the year, raising money from them. And all that casts a certain light on, what is he doing back there? And he's having to, with one hand, say, oh, yes, we're Unitarian friendly. On the other hand, in that part of the country where they actually live, they're having to play that down, saying, oh, no, we're still a good Baptist institution, right? And in fact, they've got church, meetings going all the time, and they're quite zealous in insisting, that it's a fully Christian enterprise, and we're going to build up a Bible college within it, and so on. So certainly, internally, though Booker T certainly so far transcends even any church story at all, I think it is. There's something wrong about telling a story of any version of social Christianity or even just modern Christianity during those decades without dealing with just the colossal figure, import of Booker T. Washington. He is in it and he's beyond it. Institutionally, well, there's the main thing for me in Volume 1 has to do with this is mostly an AME story for a while, This has to do with the African Methodist Episcopal Church going like wildfire in the South as the moment the Civil War is over with Turner and then the people after. The impact that has on a basically abolitionist church as it goes southern. It changes the character of the church, and then them having to sort of, at Wilberforce, kind of holding out against that. It certainly makes sense why it is that it's the AME church that is going to breed a black social gospel, since it takes such pride in its being abolitionist. On the other hand, this is a church that's got bishops and that got conservatism of various kinds right up to here. And not welcoming to upstarts like Reverend Ransom and the like when they come in and start preaching the social gospel. And so much of the institutional drama within Volume 1 just has to do with how it plays out in the AME church. And Where that story is going within that context is that, the AME Church had a tremendous opportunity during the Great Migration, and it basically flunked the test. That's the opportunity to be renewed, replenished by the many coming from the South, in kind of lonely, often kind of desperate search situations in northern urban cities. And people like, my heroes here, Ransom and Richard Wright and Jr. and others, are making the case. This is our moment to be welcome, to show what it means. We could renew this denomination by practicing the gospel here. And instead they're butting up against a lot of zero-sum thinking, or people saying, hey, we don't really want these people, and we're sure not going to sing now those spirituals that they came with, right? So that becomes part of the sort of drama of the AME Church. As I mentioned just so briefly, within AME Zion, it's a little different story because of the great influence of just one person, Alexander Walters, who becomes a bishop early on and is a remarkable figure. He's just in every organization and usually leading and trying to hold things together. And it's remarkable how radical he was, given that he is so pious. He is so he checks every box for what you would want of a kind of someone growing out of the kind of Methodist sanctificationist piety that he is coming from and still so perfectly represents. And yet he's also just check every box of what's a radical social gospeler, and there he is. So the fact that he has just the influence that he does in the AME Zion helps to bring the AME Zion Church into my story a little more. And of course, that's also the one church among these mainstream churches that, is a little bit of an exception with regard to women, with the ordination of women, since that's where it starts in the story with them and with Julia Foote. With the Baptists, of course, that here we've got they spend the whole 19th century just arguing about should we have a denomination. And it's like, are you kidding? We're Baptists, we don't trust those people, we just want to have our own. So it's so hard just to even pull together an organization, and then, so doesn't even happen until 1895. And so that draining debate just takes up so much of the oxygen of my institutional story for a good piece of Volume 1. But it also produces these extraordinary figures. And they are extraordinary, but then you get a type of figure. That is the strapping, dynamic, charismatic black minister, who is entrepreneurial, who is, as James Farmer put it, a king in a private kingdom, with the community gathered around him. And that has a different, that sort of enters this movement then differently than say, a church that's got bishops where you have to deal with bishops. So, the other, I'm not going to go there, but just to say, the other set of institutional relationships that matters even more in the early parts of Volume 2 have to do with the relationship of all these movements to the white ecumenical movement, and then to the ecumenical movement beyond just Federal Council of Churches or outfits like that, especially student Christian movement, the Wise, and so on. They are tremendously significant in the story, because most of these figures that I'm writing about, they have their public careers, and they just acquire this robust self-confidence that they can walk in and talk to anybody by virtue of having the experience of speaking at conferences and being sent by the student Christian movement to, some other country and being exposed to the world. So I'm just scratching the surface of that because I've got other fish to fry in this, but there's so much that could still be done. With the import, the legacies of that student Christian movement, and Christian Endeavor is another version of it, internationalist, basically Methodism in an international scale, that just grows. It's incredible, the reach of some of these organizations had. And though that is where you get spaces opened up, where you get people in relationships that cross racial lines and now forming trusting relationships. And it's not happening in denominations, but it is happening in those places. Yeah. I mean, he's just extraordinary eloquence and powerful. And as I say, he's the Du Bois figure in this group. And yet, it only goes so far and then not beyond. And so much of their answers to why you'd never heard of Du Bois before, well, in class I rattled off a list of 12 other people you'd never heard of either, who should have been known. I mean, that's the first thing to say, is that this is the rule. Mostly it's just down the memory hole for most of them. But even for people like Ransom, he is let down by all the organizations he's in. It's not like he's not trying. He's joining everything. He's trying to latch hold of something that would just lift him beyond this world that he's in. And that's why he does go round and around. He really doesn't want to become a bishop, because he knows where that's heading. A bishop in the AME Church, that means you're responsible for 7 or 8 states in the USA, and you just travel all the time. And the tasks are just grinding. They grind you down, they hold you down. And so he really doesn't want to end up spending the last 20 years of his life doing that, but he can't really see the parachurch things that he's been part of haven't had the life or trajectory, or aren't certain, some of them secularized. The NACP just secularized too much for him, so that he ends up saying, okay, I'm just going to hang with my own little church here and try to hold it together and try to get as much as I can out of that. And that, you can generalize that story to quite a number of others for whom finally, for all the complaints they have about the denomination, at least it's theirs, and they belong to it, and people have to deal with them in that denominational context, and so they end up taking over the magazine, as Ransom did, or the newspaper, as Richard Wright did, or create a convention within it, as Nanny Burroughs did, and getting as much as you can out of that, because most of what's successful at that parachurch level that launches any of the folks I'm talking about, it's the WISE, it's the student Christian movement. That is to say, it's organizations funded by white, missionary-oriented, usually evangelical people. Which, all praise and gratitude for that, that they existed. Are we done? Yes? I thought, all right. All right, thank you, friends. Thank you.